Now again, in this segment we're doing part 3 of our examination of the credibility of the Watchtower when it comes to their view of the cross. This section is entitled, Is God Vindicated by an Organization that Hides the Truth? Jack Finnegan isn't the only scholar aware of the cross's saving symbolism in the Old Testament. The most renowned of all Hebrew lexicons has this to say on the original word for mark used in Ezekiel 9 verses 4 and 6. This is from Brown, Driver, and Briggs, the new Brown, Driver, Briggs, Gesenius, Hebrew, and English Lexicon, page 1064. Quote, Tau, mark on forehead, sign of exemption from judgment. And they cite this text, Ezekiel 9 verses 4 and 6. So, Hebrew scholars of the last century were aware of the link between the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Tau, or T, then written X, and Jehovah's saving action. One of the most famous of 19th century commentaries elucidates the connection. This is from the Ezekiel section of Lang's commentary by Schroeder. Quote, the deeper significance that a cross was to be the mark for sparing Christian exegesis or interpretation has perceived from of old. And Schroeder cites Tertullian, Origen, Cyprian, and Jerome among the early church fathers who knew about this connection between the symbol of the Tau and the cross. And then Schroeder asks us to compare Revelation 7 verse 3 and Revelation 9 verse 4, Revelation 14 verse 1 with Exodus 12. You might remember in Exodus 12 there's the marking of the lintels of the door with the blood of the Lamb. So Schroeder, over 140 years ago, knew about this connection. As we said, Brown, Driver, and Briggs knew about it, and their successors today, republishing their Gesenius' lexicon, all know about this connection, but the Watchtower hides it. Schroeder then acknowledges that the early church fathers also were aware that the cross had an Old Testament precedent. That great Lutheran Old Testament scholar, we mentioned him in a recent video, C.F. Kyle, of the Kyle Delitzsch commentary, went so far as to translate the Ezekiel 9, 4-6 this way, quote, and Jehovah said to him, that is the destroying angel, and his 6 companions, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and mark a cross upon the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations which take place in their midst. Ye shall not touch anyone who has the cross upon him. That is Kyle, in the most famous conservative commentary of the 19th century on Ezekiel. Kyle could not help but wonder at the divine hand in this providential foreshadowing of the gospel. And again, I'll quote directly from Kyle. There is something remarkable that in this coincidence to the thoughtful observer of the ways of God, whose counsel has carefully considered all beforehand, especially when we bear in mind that the counterpart to this passage in Ezekiel, he cites again Revelation 7 verse 3, the seal of the living God is stamped upon the foreheads of the servants of God, who are to be exempted from the judgment, and that according to Revelation chapter 14 verse 1. And remember, those 2 chapters, Revelation 7 and 14, are where the sealing of the 144,000 are mentioned. They had the name of God written upon their foreheads. So much, at any rate, is perfectly obvious from this, namely that the sign was not arbitrarily chosen, but was inwardly connected with the fact which it indicated, just as in the event upon which our vision is based. That is Exodus 12, again, the first Passover, and 13 as well. The distinctive mark placed upon the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, in order that the destroying angel might pass them by, namely the smearing of the doorposts with the blood of the paschal lamb that had been slain, was selected on account of its significance and its corresponding to the thing signified. That's all from Kyle directly. Modern Christian commentator Charles Lee Feinberg, himself a converted Jew, comments on the rabbinic understanding of the significance of this mark, Tau. Jewish writers, he says, have explained the use of the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is literally mark or sign, as a signature in 3 ways. 1, since it is the last letter, it denotes completeness. 2, it is the first letter of the word Torah, or law. And 3, it is the first letter of the Hebrew word for thou shalt live. Incidentally, it is also the first letter in the Hebrew word for thou shalt die. This is all Feinberg. Feinberg goes on, Christian interpreters have been have seen a somewhat prophetic allusion to the sign of the cross in the earlier script. The last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, tau, had the form of a cross. That is X. Ezekiel, of course, could not have thought of Christian symbolism, nor is the passage a direct prediction of Christ's cross. It is a remarkable coincidence, however. That's the end of Feinberg's quote. So, the tau had the force of a signature, a seal of ownership on the object or person so marked. Those who have seen the movie Ben-Hur or other biblical epics will recall how a stamp seal in wax, etc., was that era's equivalent of the modern signature. This clue links us to another more familiar passage in the last book of the Bible. Here, G.R. Beasley Murray on Revelation 13, verse 16. Quote, the mark of the beast similarly identifies men as his servants, and without this mark they cannot live. The idea seems to reflect the practice in ancient society of marking men by branding or tattooing as the property of others, whether of slave owners or of the gods. This could be reflected as early as Isaiah chapter 44, verse 5. But the closest parallel to our passage, that is Revelation 13, 16, is 3rd Maccabees, chapter 2, verses 28 to 30. There we read that Ptolemy IV, Philopator, demanded that Jews should offer pagan sacrifices as well as sacrifices to their own god. Those who opposed this were to be put to death. Those who merely refrained from it were to be reduced to the condition of serfs and branded with the sign of the ivy leaf, the emblem of Dionysus, the Greek god, or Bacchus, Tammuz. Interesting, Tammuz is the very one that is being worshipped in Jerusalem in Ezekiel chapter 8. That's the end of the quote from Beasley Murray. We have now come full circle. Revelation, as so often, leads us back to Ezekiel, and Ezekiel, as Kyle observed above, back to the Torah. The Watchtower has made much of the cross's connection with Tammuz, the Middle Eastern fertility sun god, for instance in the book Babylon the Great, which of course is long out of print. 1963, they made much of this, the link with Tammuz, but certainly the tau or T was the first letter of the name of this Babylonian or Syrian deity. But did that fact make the T or X a pagan symbol? Does the fact that shapes, colors, and calendar dates or anything else in God's creation are appropriated for pagan use make them out of bounds for God's people? If it did, we would soon find ourselves locked out of God's good earth, and so would God himself. This fear of pagan connections can be carried to the extreme, as it was in the 1930s when the Watchtower seriously contemplated changing the names of the days of the week. JWs, however, are hardly alone in this obsession with tracing pagan roots. So in the next one we'll talk about a balanced view of pagan connections.